Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the release of the first India Rural Development Report. At the outset, may I request all of you to kindly switch off your mobile phones or put them on a silent mode. My name is Cherian Thomas. I am the CEO of IDFC Foundation, a wholly owned subsidiary of IDFC Limited, India's leading infrastructure financing intermediary. May I invite the Honorable Minister, Shri Jairam Ramesh, Member Planning Commission, Dr. Mihir Shah, Mr. Anil Baijal, Dr. Rajiv Lal, and Mr. Vikram Limai to take their seats on the dais. Let me invite Mr. Anil Baijal, Chairman, IDFC Foundation, to make his opening remarks. Mr. Baijal actually needs not much of an introduction for this gathering. He is a retired civil servant and has held various positions of responsibility in the Government of India, the last one being as the Secretary Urban Development, and under his stewardship, the JNNURM program was actually launched. Institution capacity building is very close to his heart, and that has been also a very strong focus of the work of IDFC Foundation. So I request Mr. Baijal to make the opening remarks and welcome our guests.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable Minister of Rural Development, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, and other dignitaries sitting on the dais, distinguished participants to this conference, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me welcome you all to this conference. We are indeed grateful that you could find time to be with us this morning. We are particularly grateful to our chief guest, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Minister of Rural Development, for having taken out this time to honor us with his presence. Though the minister needs no introduction, for those of you who may not know, let me mention that Mr. Ramesh is a many-faceted personality, a great intellectual, an eminent thinker and strategist, an economist totally committed to the cause of neglected and poor sections of the society, and a journalist and writer who has published a couple of books and who keeps contributing regularly to newspapers and journals. After graduating from IIT Bombay with a BTech in Mechanical Engineering, he did his MSc from Carnegie Mellon University and completed a course in Interdisciplinary Technology Policy Program from MIT. He is a founding member of the ISB, Hyderabad, and a visiting fellow and affiliated researcher at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. As regards his political career, suffice to say that he has held various assignments in different capacities in the central government. Some of the important ones include advisor to the Finance Minister and Deputy Chairman Planning Commission, Minister of State for Environment and Forests, Commerce, Industry and Power at different times. He's been the Cabinet Minister of Rural Development from July 2013. There couldn't have been a more deserving dignitary to do the honors of today's function. Mr. Mihir Shah, Member Planning Commission, has co-founded the Samaj Pragati Sahyog, one of India's largest grassroots initiatives working for water and livelihood security. He combines more than 20 years of grassroots level work with academic research and policy advocacy. In 2007, he co-founded the National Consortium of Civil Society Organizations that supports Panchayati Raj institutions in the implementation of NREGA. In the past, he has served as advisor to the commissioner appointed by the Supreme Court in the Right to Food case and to the Technical Committee on Watershed Program set up by GOI in 2006. In the latter assignment, he played a key role in drafting a landmark report arguing for radical reforms in the watershed sector. India Rural Development Report 2012-13, that is shortly going to be released by the Honorable Minister. It's a comprehensive assessment of the state of rural development in India. The report has been prepared by IDFC Foundation in collaboration with partners like the Center for Economic and Social Studies, IRMA, and Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research under the aegis of IDFC's Rural Development Network. It has also drawn substantially from inputs and contributions of several other experts from the government and the private sector, and insights provided by numerous academics, researchers, and grassroots level civil society organizations from across the country. Last but not in the least, the report has also benefited from the advice of its advisory council headed by Dr. Shah. In conclusion, I would once again like to welcome you all to this function and wish the deliberations in the panel discussions a great success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Baijal. Without much ado, we'll move to the next part of today's function. And Mr. Baijal has already talked about the report, a brief background. And I'd invite Dr. Rajiv Lal, Executive Chairman, IDFC, to quickly summarize the key highlights of the report. Incidentally, Rajiv was also a member of the Advisory Council, which was overseeing the preparation of the report. Rajiv Lal.
Honorable Minister, Honorable Member, Planning Commission, distinguished guests and friends, as the Minister certainly knows, this report has been a long time coming. It's been really a labor of love and tremendous effort. And it has been really a unique enterprise, both in process and in scope. In terms of process, Mr. Baijal indicated to you how collaborative of an effort this has been. In terms of scope, it started off as an exercise to update the status of rural infrastructure, but then gradually morphed into a really comprehensive overview over multiple decades of the evolution of rural India. The report is actually in two parts. There's the main report, which has this historical overview with empirically grounded, based on synthetic research, a review of the literature, an analysis of working group reports of various government departments, as well as our own surveys. It has the main narrative, then it has a particular thematic section which is focused on a diagnostic of the MN-Rega scheme. And then the second part of the report is a statistical annex, which is really a compendium of what we hope will be a very valuable source of data for future research and commentators to consult and utilize. I have really 5-6 minutes to give you a flavor for what this report has to say. And I will start, so it's an interpretive, it's my interpretation of the report, which in turn is an interpretation of existing research and stylized facts and all kinds of other empirical information. So the narrative of Indian rural India, the way I look at the learnings from the report, is really very complex. And is on in all complex things. There's a lot of good, but then there's also a lot of challenging. So the headline good news is quite dramatic. Rural poverty has climbed down very significantly. Just since 2004-05, rural poverty, and I don't want to go into any debate about how it is measured, no matter how you measured, has come down. But measured according to the Tendulkar methodology, it came down from 42% in 05 to 26% in 11-12. Agricultural wages have gone up. The commercialization of agriculture has increased. People are turning much more to livestock farming. Rural non-farm employment has grown dramatically. Just in 2009, rural non-farm employment accounted for about 42% of the labor force in rural India. It is probably closer to 50%, I would like to guess, today. Rural literacy is up sharply from 44% in 91 to 69% in 011. Rural-urban connectivity has grown very dramatically, and so has access to markets. And here, the role of infrastructure has been particularly dramatic. Rural penetration of telecom services since 2004 has grown from 1% to 40%. Likewise, rural connectivity through the construction and upgrading of rural roads has grown very, very dramatically. All this has led to dramatic, in my judgment, positive societal and political change in rural India. Caste hierarchies, there is evidence that caste hierarchies are beginning to break down, whereas previously, 20, 30 years ago, the narrative was the landless versus the landlords. Now the narrative is farmers versus government or state over the provision of inputs. Or it is farmers versus industry over the sharing of resources. There is still conflict, but it's a different nature of conflict, and I think that is important progress. Likewise, there is evidence that the agricultural workforce has begun to feminize. There's much greater participation of women in the agricultural labor force as men have turned to non-farm rural employment. So much for the characterization of the positives. Now, what are the challenges? There are old challenges and new challenges that have emerged. Broadly speaking, the challenges fall under three categories. First is inclusion, second is sustainability, and the third is delivery of services stroke governance. Inclusion. Although poverty levels on average have come down dramatically, inter-regional, inter-district poverty differentials have grown quite substantially. There is evidence that there are pockets of deprivation, regional pockets of deprivation. And this is connected to sustainability, and I'll come back to that very briefly in a minute. So, inclusion is not just a problem of geographic stratification, but it is also a problem of social stratification. There is evidence that certain segments of the community, particularly the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, have been particularly affected. 50% of tribal populations in particular remain mired below poverty levels. Briefly, challenges of sustainability. Fragmentation is a very important trend that is cutting across rural India. Fragmentation of land holdings. 85% of land holdings are now below 2 hectares. 67% are below 1 hectare. Degradation is another consistent trend. By some estimates, close to 60% of arable land is now degraded through overuse of chemical fertilizers, through soil erosion, and such like. Groundwater is a big problem. Water is a big problem. Groundwater has substituted surface water for irrigation. Whereas in 1960, we had only 2 lakh pump sets. In 2009, we had 20 million. A third of our districts today, is well known, are drawing more water than what is being recharged in the ground. And they are very fragile. Sustainability interacts with exclusion. And so, particularly in dry land and rain-fed areas, the sustainability challenge makes the challenge of inclusion even harder. Finally, the third challenge, the delivery of public services. As much progress as we have made across the board in improving education standards, access to electricity, and other basic services, the reality is that 20% of our population, rural population, still lives without 3 essential services: electricity, latrines, and drinking water. That's 20%, 1 in 5 in rural India still live without these 3. Nutrition, likewise, the data is worrisome, although mortality rates in women have come down dramatically. Maternal mortality has come down dramatically, has halved over the last 30 years. The reality is that anemia amongst pregnant women still remains at a startlingly high 87%. Likewise, malnutrition amongst young rural children remains stubbornly high. So the delivery of educational services, the delivery of health services in particular, remains a very problematic challenge. What are the issues? accountability, lack of focus on outcomes, lack of participation in the design of schemes. These are some of the challenges. So when you take this whole balance sheet, if you like, of good and bad, or good and challenging in rural India, I hope that the few suggestions that come out of the report will be worthy of further discussion and debate. In particular, the 3 or 4 ideas that emerge from the report with respect to future intervention and how to deal with the challenges is, first, we need greater convergence and more streamlining of the myriad schemes and interventions that we have to deal with rural challenges. We need to move towards performance-based incentives in the delivery of public services. We need real-time data on outcomes. We need more social outputs, audits, greater transparency to make the delivery of public services more accountable. We certainly need more capacity building at all levels of government, but particularly at the level of the panchayat. And finally, we need greater participation and democratization in decision making and policy design. I know the minister has thought very deeply about all these issues, and his government has, over the last 10 years, done remarkable things focused on this emerging diagnostic. So I will now request him, oh no, maybe that's not the program, Chair. So I've done my duty. I have given you, I hope, a flavor of the report and set the stage for subsequent discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv, for that very concise and succinct summary of the report's highlights. As we mentioned earlier, Dr. Mihir Shah had chaired the Advisory Council, and it was the Advisory Council which guided the entire effort, and constantly his endeavor was to raise the bar, and I hope that the final output would be one which really is very, very useful and seen as a very high quality report. So we owe a very special debt of gratitude to Dr. Mihir Shah for overseeing this entire process. I would now request him to give us the special address.
Thank you. A very good morning to all of you. I just want to begin by saying that we must thank the person who's responsible for this initiative in the first place, because this is a unique initiative taken by government. Here is a minister who's saying that, look, I don't want to bring out propaganda material. I don't want to just listen to the good news about what my government is doing. I want an objective, high quality assessment of where we are as far as rural development is concerned. And we want to engage the best minds in the country. We want a report which stands on its own in academic excellence. And we want an assessment, an evaluation, and some pointers about the direction in which we need to go forward. And it is Jairam Ramesh's initiative which has led to the publication of this report, as also, if I may mention, an earlier report on the biggest employment program in human history, the MGNREGA. The Samiksha report was a similar collection. In fact, it was an compilation of all research done on the program with not a single word from the government side, so to speak. It was really an addition to scholarly work on the subject which enabled scholars across the world to gain access to what has been studied, written, and said about NREGA across the world. And I believe I must congratulate the IDFC Foundation for again bringing out a first-rate report which gives us a snapshot of what is happening in rural India. And I'd particularly like to congratulate Dr. Ritu Anand, whose tireless efforts day and night, because I work very closely with her and I know the pain that she has gone through, thanks in part also to my insistence on certain requirements to be met. So really this is an occasion of great joy and celebration for all of us, because I think a lot of effort went into this report. As I said, not only was it not supposed to be government propaganda material, but we had an excellent advisory council of the most eminent academics in the country who have researched and worked on rural development. There were practitioners who have worked on rural development, and all that wisdom put together has resulted in really an outstanding report which we have before us. I think Rajiv has given us an excellent summary, so I'm not going to try and attempt that. I think that was really a very good snapshot picture of what the report does. I just wanted to make a few observations on what I felt are the strengths of the report and some suggestions I have on the way we could do this work further in the years to come. I think the greatest strength of the report is that it does two things. It gives us a macro overview of rural dynamics. I would recommend to all of you to particularly enjoy the first chapter. It's a unique attempt. I have not seen a comparable piece of work anywhere in the literature on rural development, probably in any country. It's an extraordinary effort to try and capture multiple dimensions of rural dynamics in India. It's not, therefore, an assessment of whether we have done well or badly. It's not really at all from a government point of view at all. It's about, suppose you're a student of rural India, what should you know about rural India today? What is changing? What is not changing so fast? What is changing more rapidly? It covers the economic dimension. It covers the social dimension, which normally in reports like this would be ignored. It covers the political dimension. It covers the policy and programmatic dimension as well. So it's got a scope which is extraordinary. It's a macro overview. It is, therefore, crisply written and gives you a snapshot picture. Each of those sections in the first chapter actually are major agendas for future research, where something has been put forward which should be discussed, challenged, debated, agreed or disagreed with, and I think that's a really powerful element in the report. But the report does much more. It actually further goes on to go into the micro details of many elements which Rajiv had very well summarized, which again give you the detailed content of what is happening in rural India, what are the attempts that the government is making to alleviate suffering, and what are the challenges that still remain. And I think each of those, again, gives pointers on both strengths and weaknesses and suggestions for possible changes that could be made in policy and programs going ahead. But as I said, it's not only addressed to government. It's actually addressed to every stakeholder in the rural landscape. And I would say strongly that this report bears translation into as many Indian languages as possible, at least into Hindi, because that would make its access to those about whom the report has been written, and I think that would be something which we should very seriously consider. I don't want to take too much of your time. I just wanted to make a few suggestions in how we could think of this report going ahead in the years to come. Firstly, I would say, whoever is the Minister for Rural Development, I would be personally very happy if Mr. Jairam Ramesh was the Minister next year at this time. I'm not sure whether he would be equally happy. But whoever be in this office, I think this is a feature that should become a regular feature, not only for the Ministry of Rural Development. Actually, it should be for all government ministries. That's a dream I have, that there would be such openness across the length and breadth of government. We don't always see it, I'd be the first to admit, but I think this is therefore setting an example. It's setting a benchmark of what we should try and attain, and we should make this a regular feature, a publication which should come out. What I would suggest further is that here in this report, we have, as Rajiv was saying, it's two sections. So one section is the overview and a certain thematic presentation. The other is the focus on the MGNREGA. Now that, of course, is important because this is such a major program. But my suggestion would be that in future, let's look at issues rather than programs. Because, that's the intellectual challenge. That's actually the challenge of understanding something in rural India. So let's take up an issue, for example, such as education or health or any other cross-cutting issue which would otherwise not get treated in that kind of depth, and look at that rather than looking at an evaluation of a government program. Now the minister is setting up the concurrent evaluation office within the Ministry of Rural Development. The Planning Commission has now set up the independent evaluation office. So there will be enough evaluation happening of government programs. But what we need from you, from a consortium of academics and from an institution like the IDFC Foundation, is a perspectival sort of, exercise where we try and understand issues in their depth and try and understand irrespective of programs and particular initiatives of the government. They will obviously enter that analysis, but it would be better, I would say, to have that kind of focus. I also just wanted to, in passing, mention a few of the weaknesses that I felt in the report. I was particularly, I would say unhappy that in the discussion on sustainability on water, there is no reference to the major paradigm shift that is being attempted in the 12th five-year plan. In fact, if I would say, just briefly comment on Rajiv's summary of the report, I would say if you read the 12th five-year plan, especially the chapters on rural development and water, which I have authored, you will find them much more severely critical of government than your own report. So I don't know which way to look at it. You've been very polite, I think, in many ways. But at the same time, I felt in the section on water and sustainability, there was a lack of understanding of what has actually been attempted, which is a major change from the past. I was particularly appalled to read that the government is contemplating the interlinking of rivers across the country. The government is not contemplating that. If you read the 12th five-year plan, there is a scathing critique of this whole initiative, this humongous plan to control nature and to divert rivers. Yes, there are pressures on the Supreme Court and others to move in that direction, but I think there is an understanding, and as you know, the 12th plan has now been approved by the National Development Council, so it's not only the Government of India's view, it's the view of all state governments. We have taken a considered view of the kinds of risks involved in this initiative. So rather than that, actually something very different, and which is much more on the lines that you spoke about in the end, in terms of a participatory approach to water management, both for surface water and groundwater, an entire program of aquifer mapping and aquifer management with focus on groundwater, which is now the primary source of water for both irrigation and domestic use. So I think there are certain elements which I thought could have been better highlighted, particularly, as I said, the sections on water, but these are just suggestions for future use. I had particularly made these points as the chair of the Advisory Council. I was a little unhappy that that was not taken on board, but really this is not the time to be pointing to a few flaws in this report. I think what we have done is a landmark contribution to scholarship on rural India, and I once again commend the IDFC Foundation and thank the Minister for making this possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shah, for those comments and particularly the suggestions for how we look at this in the future. We certainly would take those comments of yours on board. We would now have the formal release of the Rural Development Report. And may I invite the Honorable Minister to formally release the India Rural Development Report. May I invite the Honorable Minister to now share his thoughts with us and make the keynote address.
Mr. Baijal, Dr. Shah, Rajiv Lal, Mr. Cherian, Mr. Limaye, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'm delighted that this report's been finally released. I congratulate my very old friend Ritu Anand for this accomplishment, and I do want to assure Mihir that this will be an annual feature, whoever the minister is. And I'm also pleased to inform him that 2 weeks from now, we will actually be releasing the Hindi edition of this report as well. I was hoping that we would be able to release both the Hindi and the English today, but there's some problems about translation. But I entirely take your suggestion. Let's make a beginning with Hindi at least, and hope that in the years to come, other languages would also have their own reports. I think over a period of time, this India Rural Development Report should occupy the same importance in policy and scholarly debate as the World Bank's World Development Report or the UNDP's Human Development Report or the Center for Science and Environment's State of India's Environment Report. I think that's very, very important that we have an external audit of what is happening in key sectors of the economy, as Mihir Shah pointed out. At no point of time was there any attempt to influence what was being said in this report. And I would be very disappointed if there is nothing critical of what we are doing. I've read this report. I haven't read it in meticulous detail, but I've skimmed through the report. But I do want to say that the strength of this report would be the extent to which it will go to criticize and evaluate some of the programs that the government has launched. Rajiv has given a broad overview of what this report is all about. Let me share with you what was the thinking that went into the conception and the preparation of this report. First, an important question that has to be asked, as Mihir pointed out, what is the current state as far as rural dynamics is concerned? What is happening in rural India? What are the forces of change? What are the social factors that are very visible? What are the institutional changes that are very visible? What economic changes are taking place? In a broad way, not getting into the specific details in each state, but broadly, what is happening in rural society? I think this is very, very important for us to understand, and that objective has been admirably fulfilled in this report. We do get a sense of a broad brush picture of what are the changes, what are the transformations that are taking place in rural India. The second question that we sought to address is what is happening to rural employment, what is happening to rural livelihoods. And I think here there has been a very healthy debate over the past few years on whether the share of agriculture in our labor force is stagnating or is actually falling down. And I'm glad that finally in this report we have put together, Ritu and her colleagues have put together all the evidence which shows in a very robust manner the changing nature of rural employment structure. So this conventional wisdom that the share of agriculture in GDP has fallen steeply, while the share of agriculture in employment has remained virtually stagnant, I think has been debunked in this report, because what this analysis shows very clearly, as Rajiv pointed out, is the sharp increase in rural non-farm employment to the extent that today one could say at a macro level almost 50% of employment in rural India is non-farm employment. Of course, one important factor is that the non-farm employment is in turn stimulated by farm growth. In fact, one of the requirements for rapid rural non-farm employment is rapid farm growth. Many years ago, Yogendra Alag and G.S. Bhalla showed in a planning commission study how districts which had sustained a farm growth rate of over 4% per year over a 20-year period, particularly in places like Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, parts of Northern Andhra, parts of Maharashtra, were precisely the areas which were showing great buoyancy in rural non-farm employment as well. It's the farm growth stimulates secondary sector and tertiary sector growth effects, and I think that's been captured here. And therefore, the very powerful conclusion that comes out is that this traditional notion that we have a static employment structure as far as rural India is concerned is not borne out by facts. And in fact, today you are finding that rural non-farm employment across the country is accounting for almost half the employment in rural areas. So rural livelihoods is something we sought to answer. I think we got the answer. And we also got the other aspect of rural livelihoods, which is the feminization of Indian agriculture. In fact, there are some studies which I recall having read a couple of years ago, which showed that almost 1 in 3 farm households today have women as their heads. So it's a very large proportion. Women not only as agricultural labor, not only as farm labor, but as actually heads of farm-owning households. So on rural employment, I think the study, the report, puts together all the evidence that is available, and I think there is now a consensus that rural non-farm employment is the catalyst for rural employment transformation. The third question that we sought to answer through this report is what is happening to the state of rural infrastructure. And I think this is the one that has attracted the maximum attention in the Indian media, because the pink papers, some of whom I noticed sitting in front of me, very difficult to get the pink papers out at 10:30 in the morning, but I'm glad they've come. The pink papers are always worried only about rural markets, because that's where, the moolah is. And so this aspect of rural infrastructure has been commented upon. But I think what comes out of this study, what comes out of this analysis, is a lot of evidence which shows that in terms of personal consumption expenditure, in terms of connectivity, of which roads and mobiles are, of course, two very important examples, and in terms of access to electricity, there have been great advances in the improvement in rural infrastructure. It's been spotty, but as far as physical infrastructure is concerned, I think one could say that physical infrastructure in rural India has undergone a significant transformation, particularly after the Rural Roads Program was launched in the year 2000. And today, about 3.5 lakh kilometers of rural roads have been built. In another, about 1.5 lakh or 2 lakh kilometers remain to be built. The telephone density that Rajiv mentioned, going from 1 to almost 40, and the penetration of electricity and electricity owning households, electricity run households, also being quite significant. I think in terms of physical infrastructure, certainly the story is very positive, but it's not positive in terms of social infrastructure. And of course, the most visible and most significant failure in social infrastructure remains sanitation. I don't quite agree on the drinking water part, because I think on the access to drinking water, the story is far more positive. We have been able, over the last 25 to 30 years, to assure 40 liters per capita per day to a large number of rural households. But the real problem is not so much the availability of water, but it's the problems associated with water quality associated with fluoride, with arsenic, with iron, and with salinity. So in terms of drinking water, it's not so much the availability of water. I remember when the technology mission on water started in 1988, there were almost 65,000 villages. 10% of India's villages had no source. They were classified as no source villages. And today, most of those villages have a source within 3 or 4 kilometers. So the story on water is not as, on drinking water, availability of drinking water is not as depressing as the story on sanitation. And I think on sanitation, certainly the story is uniformly bad, is uniformly depressing, and almost 2/3 of the households are still indulging in open defecation across the country. And I think one factor of open defecation that has not been appreciated or acknowledged enough in our country is the link between open defecation and malnutrition. We tend to think of malnutrition and sanitation as independent silos, but actually they are closely related to each other through the phenomenon of tropical enteropathy. And now we have research that has been done by young scholars like Dean Spears, which show a very close correlation between child height and child weight and the practice of open defecation and the continuation of unhygienic sanitation practices. So on the social infrastructure part, I think the sanitation picture, to me, is the single biggest glaring failure, not just of the Indian state, I might add, but is a failure of Indian society to realize and accept the significance and the deleterious effects of continuing with this practice. A fourth question which we sought to answer was whether government programs are actually having an impact in rural society or not. And there is a very extensive discussion in this report on the Mahatma Gandhi Narega, which is, as Mihir pointed out, the most significant public works program attempted anywhere in the world. And let me say a few words on Mahatma Gandhi Narega, because that has occupied quite a substantial place in this report. Over the last 7 years, 1 in 4 rural households has had employment through this program. Roughly 1 in 4 rural households. We have not been able to guarantee 100 days anywhere. Only about 8% of the households have actually crossed 100 days. The average remains between 45 to 50 days. But there are very clear positive effects that have been documented by independent scholars, not by government studies, by independent scholars on the impacts of Mahatma Gandhi Narega. One, there is clear evidence to show that Narega has contributed to an increase in rural wages, which, as you know, is the single most important determinant of rural poverty. And therefore, to that extent, if rural poverty has come down, a large part of it is because rural wages have gone up, and a large reason why rural wages have gone up is because of the upward pressure being imposed by the wage rate under Mahatma Gandhi Narega. Second, there is ample evidence to show that in a couple of states, not in all states, in a couple of states, substantial community assets have been created, particularly in terms of water conservation structures, water retention structures, check dams, small irrigation works, and particularly after we allowed the use of Narega on private farms. Today, small and marginal farmers can use Narega for land leveling and irrigation on their private farms. The evidence has grown that a lot of erstwhile unproductive barren land has come into the fold of cultivation. In fact, in Andhra Pradesh, where I have looked at the data in some detail, about 10% of the gross cultivated area in the state has increased as a result of the Narega interventions to improve the productivity of barren and degraded lands that had been given to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes as part of the surplus ceiling land distribution program in the 70s and 80s. The third positive effect that you can see is distress migration has come down very substantially. Distress migration. I'm a great believer in migration, and I will talk about this a little later, but I think distress migration is something that none of us wants to see. We all want to see migration, but we don't want to see distress migration, and there is ample evidence to show that distress migration has come down. If you don't believe me, just go and meet the general manager of the Northern Railways, and the complaint of the general manager of the Northern Railways is that his revenue has come down very sharply after Narega was introduced, because the flow of labor from Bihar and Odisha to Punjab and Haryana has come down very substantially. And he says that, all his revenue estimates have completely gone off gear after Narega was introduced, because there is no labor moving in this direction. Both intra-state distress migration, like in Andhra and Karnataka, and interstate distress migration, like from Bihar and Orissa to Punjab and Haryana, have come down very, very substantially, and I think that's a positive step. And fourthly, I think there is ample evidence to show that traditionally discriminated groups have got greater purchasing, not just greater purchasing, but greater negotiating power on account of the many benefits they get from participating in the Narega program. And this is visible particularly insofar as Dalits and tribals are concerned, and it is visible insofar as women are concerned. For example, in Rajasthan, you would normally expect the figures that are associated in Kerala, where almost 90% of the labor under NREGA are women, or in Tamil Nadu, where almost 85% are women. But you would be surprised to know that almost 73% of the workers in Rajasthan are women. So even in North India, you find that a large number of women coming forward and adding to their sense of accomplishment, sense of negotiating power. And there are communities like in Bihar where, as a result of the NREGA interventions, the women have been able to show a new face that would otherwise they would not have been able to show. So these are the 4 positive accomplishments of NREGA. But I would be the first to admit that the program requires greater flexibility. I think the time has come for us to introduce greater flexibility. The uniform 60-40 that we have insisted upon in state after state, irrespective of whether it's a hilly state or a non-hilly state, irrespective of the ecological conditions that prevail in the local areas, is something that we need to relook. And I think this is something that will engage our attention in the months to come. I think we also need to pay far greater attention to the creation of durable community assets. Don't forget that NREGA is meant to be an employment of last resort. It's not a skilled employment program. It's an employment of last resort. It's unskilled employment for people who do not have the skills to participate in a market or a semi-market economy. So it's really last resort distress employment. Even so, I think it is possible for us to pay greater attention to the creation of more durable community assets, thereby adding to the stock of rural infrastructure. How we do it, of course, is something that we are engaged in, and I'm confident that in the next couple of weeks we will be able to announce some changes, further set of changes, in order to make durable community assets much more the focus of the program. I should mention here one example of a durable community asset is in Jharkhand, where over 78,000 dug wells have been created on account of NREGA. Now that's an example of a durable community asset which I hope will proliferate across the country. The problem with NREGA, the fundamental problem with NREGA stems from the conflicting nature of its 3 objectives. The objective number 1 of NREGA is to provide wage employment. Objective number 2 of NREGA is to create durable community assets. And objective number 3 of NREGA is to empower Gram Panchayats. Now, at no point of time can all 3 objectives, this is the economists in the room, Partha and Rajiv will understand, this is the political economy equivalent of the classic monetary trilemma. You can have 2 out of the 3 objectives, you can't have all 3 objectives. And we are having somewhat of a situation like this where the provision of wage employment, the creation of durable community assets, and the empowerment of Gram Panchayats are all 3 objectives, all equally worthwhile objectives, but which will not be fulfilled in equal measure. So I think some trade-off has to be made somewhere. And what the trade-off is, I think, needs to be worked out. And I hope that, as I said, in the months to come, based on the analysis that we've got in the India Rural Development Report, we will be able to bring about some further changes in the implementation of NREGA. I certainly don't see NREGA as a permanent employment generating program. It's a transition program for a 20-25 year period in areas, in pockets where there is still a lot of demand for distress employment, and certainly over a period of time we should allow for more skilled employment opportunities. And that's why, along with NREGA, one of the main initiatives that the Ministry of Rural Development has taken is the provision of skilled employment, to create opportunities for people from poor families to upgrade their skills and also get placement. So these are skills come placement programs. We have started a very successful program in Jammu and Kashmir, and we are now launching a program in the Maoist affected areas where almost 50,000 youth will not only be given skills but will actually be found jobs, and that would in turn create further diversification of rural livelihoods. I think there are other discussions in the report which I have not seen earlier, and I would particularly recommend to you the chapter on sustainability, because I think this is something very, very important. The objective of the 12th five-year plan is faster, inclusive and sustainable growth. It took me 2 years to get the Planning Commission to agree to the word sustainable. Finally, the Planning Commission agreed, and I think sustainability is very, very crucial. And in spite of what Mihir has said on water, I think there is a fairly extensive discussion here on land, on the whole issue of land, productivity of land, the productivity of water use, and these are very, very important issues because if we are not able to increase the productivity of our land and water use, then we are not going to be able to sustain the pace of transformation that we have seen. And I particularly commend the chapter on sustainability, because this is something that often tends to get overlooked in this report, in such reports. Let me make a couple of comments on one theme which has bothered me for quite some time in the context of rural development. The day before yesterday, I was in Ahmedabad, and I went to the Gujarat Vidyapit, which, as you know, was started by Mahatma Gandhi. And I met about 50 or 60 Gandhian organizations. And the Vice Chancellor of the university started the discussion by asking me, which I thought was a very basic existential question as far as I was concerned. He asked me, are you in the business of rural transformation or rural transition? Now, I scratched my head and I said, no, that's a very, Sudarshan, this is a very interesting question. But I think it's a very profound question. This report deals with rural transformation. It does not deal with rural transition. But what is happening is that today there is a very powerful currents of rural transitions also taking place. If you look at the census for 2011, the growth of the census towns, the almost threefold increase in the census towns, which are basically rural areas with urban characteristics. These are basically rural villages. These are basically villages, overgrown villages. These are governance structure is panchayats, but they meet all the characteristics of urban areas. They have population more than 5,000. They have a population density more than 400 per square kilometer, and 75% of male employment is outside agriculture. So the three indicators of urbanization are met, but their governance structures are still rural. And I was just looking at some of the numbers, interesting numbers. In 2001, we had 1,362 such census towns. And in 2011, the census towns had increased to 3,894. Almost a threefold increase. And this is in West Bengal, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, UP and Himachal Pradesh, which accounted for almost 2/3 of this increase. Now, what this shows to my mind, is that this traditional academic policy approach of rural and urban is far too limiting a concept. And what is actual reality is not a rural-urban dichotomy, but a rural-urban continuum. That there is migration from rural areas to rural areas. There is migration from rural areas to semi-urban areas. There is migration from rural areas to urban areas. There is migration from semi-urban areas to urban areas. And of course, there is migration from urban areas to urban areas. So migration in India, when we look at it, when you look at all the debate that takes place in India, it's seen as a dichotomous binary situation of rural and urban. Ministry of Rural Development, Ministry of Urban Development, Secretary Rural Development, Secretary Urban Development. These are all manifestations of a certain mindset. But I think what India is undergoing across the country is not just urbanization, but what I have called earlier a process of rurbanization. That rural areas are becoming urban. They retain rural characteristics in terms of governance, something that Rajiv talked about, which is absolutely essential, but they meet all urban characteristics. Now, we have no interventions to deal with such a situation. We have absolutely no program, no policy to deal with rurbanization, the growth of census towns, these large villages which have become urban pockets and urban agglomerations. And I think the sooner we recognize this, the better. We've launched a small program called Pura, but that's a drop in the ocean. I don't think that will go a long way for dealing with the requirements of infrastructure for 3,894 census towns. It may help in 1 or 2 or 3 towns, but I think what we need to recognize is the need for very active interventions, and as Rajiv has pointed out, it's not just programmatic interventions, but also looking at governance structures, how these areas are going to be governed. Because today they are governed as Gram Panchayats, but actually they are urban areas. And I think this creates a lot of tension and creates a lot of anomalies in the way these places are growing. So once again, let me congratulate IDFC and Ritu and all her colleagues for this initiative. And I am sure that this report will evoke a lot of comment. It would certainly evoke a lot of analysis, further analysis. This first effort has largely been a consolidation of existing work and existing research. Over a period of time, I think we can also think of commissioning research on specific themes, having reports anchored around a specific theme. I think these are some of the innovations that we can think of. We are about to launch, the Ministry of Rural Development is about to launch the Concurrent Evaluation Office, which will supplement the Independent Evaluation Office. The Independent Evaluation Office is really a forensic pathologist. He will do pathology on a program 4 times a year. But the Concurrent Evaluation Office is your daily physician whom you go to on a day-to-day basis to figure out what's wrong with you. It's taken us a long time to get the Concurrent Evaluation Office going, but we've got it going, and I think in a couple of weeks it will become operational, and all rural development programs. Today we spend over 100,000 crores a year. The central government alone spends over 100,000 crores a year on rural development programs, next only to defense. And there is no concurrent evaluation except the reports that the state governments keep sending in a mechanical way. So much of funds released, so much of funds spent, and that's the extent of our concurrent evaluation. So once this hard-nosed concurrent evaluation, which will be done through a network of 50-60 independent institutions, will take place, I think we will be in a position to supplement the work that such reports bring out. I should also add here that very soon, in about 2 or 3 weeks' time, we will be launching officially the Bharat Rural Livelihoods Foundation. Venture between the government of India and some private trusts, and this would scale up civil society interventions in about 170 districts of India, in eastern India, central India and western India, which are predominantly tribal in nature. So the Bharat Rural Livelihoods Foundation is a very important initiative, and it's a government initiative which will not be run by government servants. This is what I want to underscore. The chairman of the Bharat Rural Livelihoods Foundation will not be the Minister for Rural Development. It would be an independent person from the outside world. The CEO of the foundation will be selected from the outside world. It would be a professional body run at an arm's length relationship from the government, because government has demonstrated its capacity to run down organizations. An organization that I have in my ministry called Kapat, which is supposed to fulfill this objective, has had 28 DGs in 25 years. So with such a situation, you're never going to have an organization going to work. The Bharat Rural Livelihoods Foundation is a government-funded but not government-run organization. So it would be run by professionals. It would largely deal with the issues that have been raised in this report and give policy and program content to many of the recommendations that this report and future such reports will make. So with the hope that we will soon release the Hindi edition, this will become an annual feature. You will have an annual theme for which this report will be anchored in. Let me once again thank the IDFC for taking this initiative, and let me also end with a hope that the gestation period for future reports will be considerably shorter, not like an infrastructure project in this country. It would be much quicker, so that we can actually have some meaningful policy analysis and dialogue on your recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister, for your very, very captivating address. We have some time for question and answers. This is an opportunity for us to ask questions of the Minister. So we have about 10 minutes. So if there are questions from the audience, Honorable Minister, if there are questions from the audience, I think this is an opportunity for the audience to also ask questions.
This side. I am from Jitendra from Down to Earth. District planning committee which should be formed in every district are not working or not have been formed. So what is the reason behind this?
Well, according to the 73rd and 74th amendments, district planning DPCs were supposed to be formed. The formation of the DPCs is entirely the prerogative of the state governments. We can certainly, the central government can certainly say that we will not release money to you if you do not constitute the DPCs. In one or two instances, that has actually happened. But by and large, the DPCs in many states have not been constituted because there has been marked reluctance to share power. The 73rd and 74th Amendment is fundamentally about sharing power. And no MP or MLA wants to share power with some other elected representative. So in one state, a minister has been made chairman of a DPC. Now this negates the spirit of the constitutional amendment. In some states, the Zilla Parishad Adhyaksh is the chairman of the DPC. Okay, so different states have followed different models, but your conclusion is absolutely right. By and large, the DPCs, and Mihir can add to this, by and large, the DPCs have really not become functional organizations. And a lot of programs like the BRGF, the Backward Region Grant Fund, is anchored in the DPC. And if the DPCs are not effective, the programs lose their effectiveness.
I'll just add one thing. I've been speaking about the minister, I'm sorry he's sitting next to me, but in the 12th plan, the Ministry of Rural Development volunteered to take a 1% cut in its huge allocations which exist, of course, and transfer that to the Ministry of Panchayati Raj. And one of the reasons why the DPCs don't function or the Panchayati Raj institutions generally are weak is that they lack capacity. One of the points that Rajiv made about state capacities at that level are very weak, And I believe that we have launched now what we call the Rajiv Gandhi Panchayat Sashaktikarana Abhiyan, largely thanks to the gesture of the Ministry of Rural Development, which has now got an allocation of 6,000 crores, which will be devoted entirely to building capacities of these institutions so that genuine DPCs can come up and function in the manner in which they were visualized in the amendments to the Constitution.
See, one aspect that I didn't touch on is I think there are references to it in the report, which you will see, is there has been an institutional transformation in rural India. Let's not underestimate the institutional transformation. And the two dimensions of this institutional transformation, one is the emergence of Panchayati Raj institutions. You have today in India almost 40 lakh elected representatives. 40 lakh elected representatives. And out of these 40 lakh elected representatives, something like 14 or 15 lakh are women. You know, and increasingly more and more states are saying 50% should be women. So you will find the Panchayati Raj institutions, the Gram Panchayats, the Prakhand Panchayat, which is the block Panchayat, and the Zilla Panchayat. So almost 40 lakh elected representatives. Now, are Panchayat institutions driving better outcomes? That's a separate issue. But you have today elected bodies in rural India. That's number one. Number two, you have, depending on the numbers, broadly, you have about 25 lakh women self-help groups. About 25 lakh women self-help groups, and roughly about 3 crore women as members of the self-help groups. Now again, are women self-help groups driving better outcomes? That remains to be seen, that remains to be studied. There is evidence to show that where Panchayat institutions are strong, outcomes are better. There is evidence to show where women self-help groups are strong, outcomes are better. But I think these institutional transformations in rural India are very, very significant. And if we can strengthen Panchayat institutions, which are institutions of representation, and if we can strengthen women's self-help groups, which are basically institutions of participation, I think many of the issues that Rajiv has talked about and this report brings out will find an institutional focus for delivery. Otherwise, he's talked about reforms in delivery systems. How do you get better services to people? And increasingly, there is evidence to show that the more decentralized the delivery, the more accountable the delivery. And the decentralization delivery takes place either through elected Panchayat institutions, or through women's self-help groups, or through sugar cooperatives. It might be in the case of Maharashtra or parts of Gujarat, or milk cooperatives. So I think we need to look at these institutional forms very, very closely.
Okay. Yeah, one question. Please introduce yourself before you ask the question.
Shailesh Pathak. Minister, you spoke about the continuum between rural and urban India. In many ways, the governance structure challenges are the same because of something called rotational reservation. And capacity for local champions is not being built because out of the 40 lakh elected representatives, almost 35 lakh will not be able to run for office because of rotational reservation the next time. So, do you think now that 20 years have elapsed, do you think it's enough and let's do away with rotational reservation? Otherwise, we have HMPs, hereditary members of parliament, who do not have fresh talent coming up to challenge them.
I don't see, actually in many parts of India that I have seen, particularly in the states where the 73rd and 74th Amendment have been taken seriously, let's say West Bengal, let's say Karnataka, the parts of Kerala, certainly Kerala is one state. Two things have happened. One is that the incentive for upward mobility in the political ladder is not very great, because the real stuff is at the district and the block at the Gram Panchayat level. Nobody wants to make, the normal political trajectory is you become a local body, then from local body you become slightly higher, from then you go to become an MLA, then you become an MP. But in West Bengal, traditionally, people have not wanted to be MLAs and MPs. They wanted to be Zilla, Gramadhyakshas or what are they called? Sabhavadipatis. Because that's where most of the delivery of programs takes place. And so is the case in Kerala. So is the case in Karnataka. So I think, while it is true that we should allow, I think your question is, you should allow for people to move up the political ladder. But I think the way the programs are being structured, more and more people, an average district in India today, there is no such thing as an average district. You've been a district collector. Average district gets about 600 crores a year from all government programs, central government, state government put together. A district Zilla Adhyaksh chairman or a district collector or a CEO, as the case may be, is handling 600 crores worth of development funds. And nobody wants to give that up for being a MLA or an MP. And I think that's good, because the outcomes that you want, better outcomes in terms of social services, will only come when you empower functionaries at a lower level and not functionaries at the highest level. Most of our empowerment has taken place at the higher levels. We have not empowered people at the local. I think Mr. Manishankar here is 100% right. You have to devolve funds, functions and functionaries. We haven't done that completely. We've done it spottily. And I think unless we do all three, devolve the funds, we devolve the functions have been devolved through the constitutional amendment. Functionaries have not been devolved. Funds, partial devolution has taken place, but not entirely 100% there. More you empower the local functionaries, politically, administratively and financially, I think you will get better outcomes. And I think that's the lesson that we learn from all the success stories of transformation that we have in our country.
Good morning, sir. I have a question in relation to the opportunity that has unfolded in relation to CSR under the new Companies Act. Can we not look at that as a unique opportunity where we can bring in the private sector, sensitize them, bring in their skills and also their engagement in the projects in the rural social infrastructure area? But this is where we would be able to link all sides. It's not just the moolah issues that we, as you mentioned, but the skills and capacity building. And that will also bring in the younger generation into the mainstream, and they will take back to the private sector and other economic activities that they are doing.
My name is Sandeep Das. I work for Financial Express. As we talk of convergence, don't you think time has come to merge Ministry of Panchayat into Rural Development Ministry? Because it was created out of exigencies to accommodate one of your cabinet colleagues. First question. The second question is don't you think this today the Sarpanch, as the workload of Sarpanch is too high, and in terms of facilities given to him or her, is hardly anything is given to him. So, thank you.
मेरा एक सवाल है. मैं पोपटराव पवार, पंचायत सरपंच, हिवरे बाजार, महाराष्ट्र. एक सवाल मेरा ये है कि आप बहुत सारी स्कीम, इंडिविजुअल स्कीम्स, अभी नरेगा हो, IWMP वाटरशेड प्रोग्राम हो या फूड सिक्योरिटी मिशन भी आ रहे, लेकिन आज ग्राम सभा की हालात हम देखेंगे तो लोग ग्राम सभा सारी ऑन पेपर ऐसी ही चलती. तो क्या आप इंडिविजुअल स्कीम को ग्राम सभा के अटेंडेंस के लिए कंपल्सरी कर सकते हो? एक सवाल है. और दूसरा सवाल है, जितना अभी गांव से हम तालाबों से पानी अर्बन और इंडस्ट्रियल यूज के लिए ला रहे, तो क्या आप CSR में वो कंपल्सरी कर सकते, जितना पानी इंडस्ट्री और अर्बन एरिया कारपोरेशन उठाएंगे वो रिसाइकल करके वापस वो डैम में डाल देंगे? अगर ऐसा हो सकता है तो अर्बन टू रूरल जो माइग्रेशन है वो रुक सकता है.
पोपटराव जी, मैं पहले आपका सवाल का जवाब दूंगा. ग्राम सभा को और सशक्त बनाने के लिए क्या करने हैं उस पर बहुत बातचीत हुई है, पर आप जानते हैं कि सभी राज्यों में ग्राम सभा को कागजी अधिकार दिए गए हैं, पर साल में मुश्किल से 3 बार ग्राम सभा बुलाया जाता है. मुश्किल से 26 जनवरी, 15 अगस्त,
2 अक्टूबर। हालांकि सब राज्यों में ये कहा गया है कि 4 बार मिलना चाहिए, पर आप जानते हैं कि ग्राम सभा मिल नहीं सकते हैं। और जब ग्राम सभा मिलता है 10% या 20% वहां मौजूदगी होती है। जो आपने सवाल उठाया है बहुत अहम सवाल है, और जो आपने ग्राम सभा के द्वारा हिवड़े बाजार में करके दिखाया है, मैं उम्मीद करता हूं कि हम हर ग्राम सभा में ये कर सकते हैं। पर हकीकत अलग है। हकीकत, राजनीतिक हकीकत यह है कि कोई भी राज्य सरकार, हर राज्य सरकार केंद्र से और अधिकार मांगती है, पर वही राज्य सरकार पंचायतों को अधिकार देने के लिए तैयार नहीं। सभी मुख्यमंत्री विज्ञान भवन में बैठकर बुलंद आवाज में बोलते हैं हमें केंद्र सरकार से और अधिकार चाहिए, प्लानिंग कमीशन को बंद कीजिए और हमको और मजबूत बनाइए, पर खुद अपने राज्य में वो अधिकार पंचायती राज संस्थाओं को देने के लिए तैयार नहीं है। तो इस माहौल में हम क्या कर सकते हैं? ग्राम सभा, ग्राम पंचायत को हम मजबूत कर सकते हैं। और नरेगा से, आप जानते हैं, नरेगा से हर ग्राम पंचायत को, हमारे देश में अभी 2.5 लाख ग्राम पंचायत हैं, हर ग्राम पंचायत को औसत के रूप से 18 से 20 लाख रुपया मिलता है हर बार, हर साल। तो पहली बार ग्राम पंचायत में कुछ पैसा आ रहा है काम करने के लिए, नहीं तो सिर्फ कागज आते थे, चिट्ठी आता था, वक्तव्य बयान आते थे, पर पैसा तो नहीं आया करता था। तो नरेगा से कुछ बदलाव आया है, नरेगा से कुछ बदलाव आया है, क्योंकि ग्राम पंचायत के द्वारा काम किया जा रहा है। पर मैं समझता हूं ग्राम सभा को और ये बहुत मैंने कोशिश की है। आप जानते हैं मेंढा लेका जो गढ़चिरौली में है, आप ही के राज्य में पृथ्वीराज चौहान जी और मैं, हम गए थे, और जो फॉरेस्ट राइट्स एक्ट है उसके तहत बांस की जिम्मेदारी हमने फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट से लेकर, यू नो दैट, फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट से लेकर हमने ग्राम सभा को सौंपी है। और देवाजी टोफा का क्या कहना है? देवाजी टोफा का कहना यह है कि दिल्ली मुंबई में हमारी सरकार, मेंढा लेखा में हम ही सरकार। तो फॉरेस्ट राइट्स एक्ट में जो बैम्बू की जिम्मेदारी है फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट से लेकर हमने ग्राम सभा को सौंपा है। पहले ग्राम सभा को मुश्किल से 25-30 हजार रुपया मिलता था। पिछले साल मेंढा लेखा के ग्राम सभा को बांस की व्यापार से 1 करोड़ रुपए की आमदनी हुई है, 1 करोड़ रुपए की। पर मुझे अफसोस है कि दूसरा मेंढा लेखा नहीं है हमारे देश में, एक ही मेंढा लेखा है। 2-2.5 लाख ग्राम पंचायत हैं, उनमें से सिर्फ 1 ग्राम पंचायत में हम ये कर पाए हैं। तो आप अपने आवाज उठाइए और सरकार पर और दबाव रखिए ताकि जो पैसा जा रहा है ग्राम सभा की निगरानी से जाना चाहिए। वाटरशेड की बात कही आप, हिवड़े बाजार में आपने वाटरशेड, सूखाग्रस्त इलाका है, सूखेग्रस्त इलाके में आपने हरियाली कैसे लाई है? वो वाटरशेड प्रोग्राम से लाया है। तो अगर कोई ऐसा हमारे देश में कोई कार्यक्रम है कि 1 पोपटराव पवार से 2.5 लाख पोपटराव पवार हम बना सकते हैं, वो मुझे आप बताइए। हाँ, कोई क्लोनिंग प्रोग्राम हो या ट्रेनिंग प्रोग्राम हो, आप बताइए, हम कर सकते हैं। नहीं तो जो आपने अभी दर्द और पीड़ा प्रकट की ना, वो ऐसे ही रह जाएगा। पर ट्रेनिंग की जरूरत है। ये जो मिहिर शाह जी ने अभी कहा, हम ग्राम सभा, ग्राम पंचायत, सरपंच, मुखिया, ट्रेनिंग पर हमने ज्यादा ध्यान नहीं दिया है। उनको ट्रेनिंग देना चाहिए, उनको मौके देने चाहिए, उनको अधिकार देने चाहिए। वो सवाल पीछे उठाया था सरपंच के बारे में। सरपंच को तो हमने जिम्मेदारियां दे दी हैं, पर उनको हमने सुविधा नहीं दे पाए हैं। तो जब तक हम सुविधा नहीं देंगे, वो अपना अधिकार का इस्तेमाल सही ढंग से नहीं कर पाएंगे। There was one question, interesting question on CSR. I want to take that with an interesting question which has relevance to IDFC also. You know, now Companies Act has been amended. 2% mandatory corporate social responsibility, and I hope it will really be social responsibility, not, doing many things sort of naam ke vaste and passing it off in corporate social responsibility ho gaya. Now the best example I have seen of the use of CSR in an organized way is in Raigad district of Chhattisgarh. Shailesh, you know Amit Kataria? Amit, who's the district collector, what he has done, in my view, is a template which can be done across the country. The IDFC should look at this. What he has done, he has created a district CSR fund. There are 50 odd companies working in that district. He pools all the CSR funds in that fund. He doesn't actually pool the fund. He just notionally pools that fund. Jindal so much, SAIL so much, NMDC so much, Tata's so much, Monet so much. Total for that district comes to about 100 crores a year. What he then does, he has prepared a district infrastructure plan. From a district's point of view, what are the gaps? Roads, schools, Anganwadi centers, primary health centers, sub-centers, what all? Transformers. He has identified a district infrastructure plan. What he then does is he sits with all the CSR guys, shares with them his infrastructure plan, and through a process not of issuing a fatwa, which collectors are fond of doing, but through a process of interaction, identifies how that 100 crores is going to be spent. So Jindal knows that his money is going to be spent for these purposes. Tatas know that their money is going to be spent for these purposes. The state government doesn't execute the works. The works are executed by the companies themselves. But the projects are identified by the company in consultation, participation, coordination with the district administration. I think this is a very interesting model. What he does, the advantage is, CSR does not become a random scattershot activity. Because as you yourself say, one district getting 100 crores per year in CSR is not a small amount. And I think that in Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, parts of Andhra, you will find many districts getting more than 100 crores a year, where there are minerals and power plants and steel plants and so on and so forth. This is something that you should look at. How you can not centralize the use of CSR. You shouldn't centralize it. But I think the question that is being asked is, how do you make intelligent use of the CSR money? Otherwise, the danger is that the CSR money will be spent on what the company thinks is CSR, but actually may not be CSR from the district's point of view.
Thank you. I'm sure there'd be many more questions, but we have to close the session, and we can continue with the questions over the coffee break later. I'll just request Vikram Limai, MD and CEO of IDFC, to come and deliver the closing remarks.
Morning, everyone. At the outset, I'd like to thank the Honorable Minister, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Dr. Mihir Shah, Rajiv, and others for sharing their thoughts and insightful comments on the whole spectrum and gamut of issues facing rural development. I also want to once again congratulate Ritu and the team and all our partners who've put together an excellent report that we've released today. I think it's quite clear that the complexity and the range of issues facing rural development are quite diverse, and we need to make sure that we're geared up to not only reflect on what we've done so far in the last decade, and that is not insignificant, but also the challenges that face us going forward. And some of the common themes that have been raised which we need to keep in mind as we continue this debate and discussion and analysis going forward, surround things like inclusivity, sustainability, governance, empowerment, and the fact that we need to figure out more efficient ways of delivering public services at the rural level in order to make sure that this challenge of rural transition and transformation are both actually achieved in a way that gets us to where we want to be in some kind of reasonable time frame. It's obviously very important to make sure that people who are focused on this effort are actually as passionate and as knowledgeable as our current minister. So it's indeed our hope that going forward as well, given the importance of this area to the entire growth and prosperity of the country, that we will continue to have someone as passionate about these issues and as knowledgeable about these issues as our current minister is. So with that, I'd like to just conclude by once again thanking Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Dr. Mihir Shah, and all of you for coming this morning. Please join us for tea and the session thereafter in terms of the panel discussion.
Yeah, we have just one small task to do, and as a token of our thanks, we'd like to make a small presentation to our honorable guests. The gift includes a certificate stating that a small grove of trees has been planted in each of your names. We'll have to check that out. We don't have data. And also to Dr. Mihir Shah. Thank you. With that, we conclude our session.